Welcome to Let's Talk Global Business, the show in which we look at the economic and business trends connecting the world. I'm Sara Murray, Managing Director, International Conference Board, the member-led global think tank that delivers trusted insights for what's ahead. We're all familiar with the term 4-day work week, but what does it really mean in practice? Is it just a long weekend disguised as a productivity hack, or is it a genuine rethinking of how we restructure our time, energy, and output at work? Would workers be better off being given an extra 52 days holiday a year? And if it works, why aren't more companies doing it? Joining us from Amsterdam is Will Hedges, VP Finance and Operations, Meridia. And from Canada, we have Joe O'Connor, Chief Executive Officer at Worktime Revolution. Welcome both.
Good to be here.
Hi, Sarah. Great to be here.
So let's start with Will and then Joe. Is the 4-day work week working?
Well, I'm sure Joe can provide much more context on the wide global picture than me, but from a personal perspective and from Meridia, I see the benefit each and every day.
I think it is certainly working for the vast majority of organizations that have adopted it globally. And I think it does, to your point in the introduction, it does involve a radical rethinking of not just when we work, but also how we work. And I think many of the organizations that have had most success with it have approached it from that perspective, using it not just as a perk or increased expanded employee benefit, but really as a forcing function and an incentive to rethink ways of working and to incentivize productivity.
So let's just backtrack a little here, Joe. Where did the idea of the 4-day work week come from originally?
Well, I think the idea of a 4-day work week has been discussed for many decades. Even the former US President Richard Nixon predicted in the 1950s that we were on the cusp of a 4-day work week. But really from the late 70s, early 80s, this topic lost momentum. If you look at most advanced Western economies, our work time has remained relatively stagnant despite massive advances in technology and increases in productivity during that period. And I would say it's only really been in the last decade or so that this conversation has really reignited. For me, I would date that or track that back, particularly to the initiative launched by the Icelandic government that ran between 2015 and 2019 that was hugely successful. For me, on a personal level, I first became interested in this topic in Ireland back in 2018 when I was involved in some research looking at the Irish Public Service, where we effectively discovered that we had a lot of working parents, mostly women, who had voluntarily chosen to reduce their work time in exchange for an equivalent reduction in pay. And this was commonly to, manage caring and domestic responsibilities outside of work. It was very common for people returning from maternity leave, for example. But what we discovered was that in almost every case, these working parents had actually not seen an equivalent change in their job expectations and responsibilities. And the amount of output that they were achieving and the performance that they had at work was broadly in line with their full-time colleagues. And that's really what got me interested in this question of, is there an opportunity for us to, have we got the productive capacity and the technological tools at our disposal to achieve more in less time? And much of my work over the last 7 years has been focused on that.
And where does this discussion around the 4-day week stand at the moment? Are you seeing more companies adopt it, or has it gone into reverse?
I would say between 2020, at the beginning of the pandemic, and 2023, we saw an almost exponential growth of organizations experimenting with this, implementing this, driven by the radical shift to employee preferences and work flexibility from COVID and later the Great Resignation. I would say since then, we are still seeing more and more companies globally adopt this from a very low baseline. I think the novelty factor and the momentum isn't what it was a couple of years ago. The employment market is very different today to what it was a couple of years ago. The pendulum has somewhat swung back to the employer. But I do think that long term, for the first time, the 4-day work week across many different countries and many different industries has been established as a credible workplace strategy that can work for both employer and employee. And I think as we move into the future with demographic shifts, with the impact of AI on jobs and work, I think it's inevitable that the future of work is going to involve, less work but more effective work.
Thank you. Will, has Meridia always had a 4-day work week in place?
Yeah, so Meridia adopted the 4-day week shortly after the company was founded, so around 10 years ago now. And at the time, it came about through several different factors. I think two of the first employees were already on 80% contracts by choice. And as you mentioned, Joe, it's actually in the Netherlands, it's a very common mechanism in place, all sizes of companies, and something that's quite actively adopted is to take a shorter contract by choice. On top of that, the founders were doing a lot of research that actually 4-day weeks didn't lead to a marked decline in productivity. And we were discovering more and more materials that all seem to be agreeing with that hypothesis. Also, a big factor was a lot of the team were at risk of burning out at that stage. I think, as is very typical with early stage ventures, there's a huge amount to do and not enough time, and it does create a lot of pressure. So the management and the founders were very concerned about that. And I think an additional factor, which actually often I don't read as much about in these situations, was actually the company was really after a way to distinguish itself on the labor market. So as an early stage venture, you obviously can't compete on wages alone with some of the bigger companies, but you do want to be able to attract the top caliber talent. So yeah, the company found introducing the 4-day week was a way to distinguish themselves, and yeah, another good tool in that battle.
And how does this look in practice, Will? Is it different days off for people or the same day off for everyone?
Yeah, so typically most take the Fridays, but some also do take Wednesdays, which we can be flexible for. And as a company, this really helps us out for particular roles. For example, our tech team, where we do need to have coverage across all days. But I think within those 4 days, like, the key is that we really do need to adopt the work smarter rather than harder ethos. As you know, by nature, 40 hours doesn't fit into 32. But I think this is the key point for us, is that it really creates this necessary stimulus where everyone is going into work knowing and actually have this mindset, okay, of how can I use my time more effectively and get more done in a shorter period, which is, yeah, permeates through all their work, not just in relation to the reduced hours.
Thank you. If we now move to pay and productivity, Joe, why a 4-day work week instead of just more paid leave?
So I think the biggest benefit of a 4-day work week over things like unlimited holidays, increasing paid leave, and so on, is that at its heart, it is a collective structured solution rather than an individual accommodation. And as a result, if it's designed and positioned in the right way, it can really mobilize and incentivize teams towards figuring out better, more effective, more productive ways of working, rather than leaving that entirely up to the individual to figure out. And so I think at its heart, to believe that a 4-day work week can work and to make it work, you need to buy into 3 core philosophies. Number one, that modern productivity is no longer just a function of hours over output, that productivity has changed. It is as much in many roles now about effectiveness as it is about efficiency. And therefore that requires, things like problem solving, creativity, decision making, innovation. And these are things that really rely on human recovery and also motivation. The second thing is that a lot of the factors that are holding back organizational productivity today are also the same things that are wearing down employee well-being. So just to give you some statistics, according to a study from Asana last year looking at desk workers, they found that desk workers spent on average about 103 hours in unnecessary meetings, 209 hours on duplicative work, and 352 hours talking about work. So we have this crisis in modern work around busy work. And if you can actually start to address these types of factors, you can achieve an outcome that actually both improves organizational productivity as well as employee well-being. And the third factor is that question of motivation. The fact that in many productivity initiatives today, employees do not have adequate incentives to enthusiastically buy into that productivity initiative.
And does productivity really go up or just shift?
I think some organizations that we've worked with have actually managed to realize a productivity benefit. Other organizations have managed to, increase productivity but maintain output. So they've increased productivity because they're doing more in less time. They're achieving the same output, but the benefits of this are much more widespread. So to Will's point, a lot of the organizations that approach us are looking for a dynamic differentiator in terms of their talent proposition. This is also something that many studies that I've been involved in have shown pretty dramatic reductions in absenteeism. So because people, A, have more rest and recovery time, that benefits sickness levels, and B, because employees have this additional day to schedule their personal out of work appointments, like medical appointments around, absenteeism drops. We also have seen significant reductions in recruitment and retention costs, where because you have less unplanned people leaving the company, you're able to save money in terms of the cost of hiring and retraining and upskilling staff. So there's a number of second order benefits to this from an organizational perspective, that if you can actually maintain productivity, you can really come out up from the 4-day work week.
Thank you. Will, do you think this model is possible everywhere or only in small, agile kind of startup companies in certain sectors?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, because I think by far the biggest barrier for most businesses is adoption and breaking the status quo rather than any inherent difficulties in incorporating a 4-day week into its business model. I mean, you only need to look at the impact, say, from COVID on working from home to see that global shifts in ways of working are possible. But yeah, hopefully it doesn't take a global pandemic to cause a bigger shift for this one.
And Joe, what about developing economies or industries already facing labour shortages?
Well, I think whether we're talking about geography or industry, the question is really about what is the baseline. So if you take, Mexico, for example, Mexico are now on a roadmap to reduce their work week from 48 hours to 40 hours by 2030. So they're obviously not going to shift in the same way as countries like Spain, Iceland, Portugal to a reduced work week. Their baseline is already much greater than that. We see similar developments in Asia, where in Korea, they're the Democratic candidate who's leading by a long distance in the polls has proposed a 4.5-day work week, working towards a 4-day week. But again, coming from a baseline in Asia of much more long hours and overwork. And I think the same is true at an industry level. I mean, if you take the 5-day work week, when it was popularized about 100 years ago, it started in manufacturing primarily, beginning with Henry Ford. And that was really where the power base in the economy lay a century ago, back in that industrial age. I think today we all know that the power base largely does lie in knowledge work. It lies in technology. This is really a big driver of economic growth. And I think with any major transition, it isn't going to be all at once. I think that there's things that governments and policymakers can do to make this a smoother, fairer transition. But there are certain industries that are going to be better positioned to make this happen more quickly and in a beneficial way. Let's take healthcare as an example. I would not propose that in healthcare, you can do the same thing as maybe you can do in a tech firm, whereby you can effectively reduce hours, maintain or improve productivity without increasing headcount. But if you think about it from a different perspective, we have a massive global crisis in most health systems of overwork and burnout amongst medical professionals. This is leading to huge costs in terms of medical error. And so if we approach it from the perspective of reduced work time in those industries is actually an investment to really address these underlying staff and patient challenges that we're facing.
We're going to take a short break, and when we come back, we'll continue this discussion on the 4-day work week. Please note that you can find the entire catalogue of podcasts from this series on our website.
For future-forward insights on AI and implications for HR, culture transformation, and the future of work, come join us on September 4 and 5 in Singapore, Future People Asia, where you will have the opportunity to meet your peers. 150 heads of HR, heads of talent, L&D, and inclusion are expected to participate. Come and join us, meet your peers, learn, and share.
Hello and welcome back to this conversation with Will Hedges and Joe O'Connor. We've been talking about the 4-day work week, how it started, what it looks like in practice. I want to turn the discussion to some of the challenges. What could go wrong? So, is there a risk that businesses use it as an excuse to cut wages? Will, would you like to go first?
Yeah, sure. I think well, to sort of reframe the question to my earlier point in terms of how it can help smaller companies be more competitive in the labor market. I think if you see that as smaller businesses be able to compete on with employees that they wouldn't otherwise be able to hire, then this only adds to competition, which should lead to better benefits packages overall for staff, whether that's through wages or through other benefits such as having a 4-day week. So I think actually it should lead to overall better packages.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And Joe, the hidden costs. So, could there be burnout from compressed weeks, or people taking on second jobs? Do you see any of that in the research?
So we partnered in many of the global pilots with researchers at Boston College, the University of Cambridge, and other leading institutions. And one of the things that we actually tracked and studied was this question of work intensity. And what we found in many of the programs that I was involved in was work intensity actually went down, even though people were expected to do more in less time. But I think it is a risk if you approach this and design this incorrectly. And what I mean by that is, the productivity benefits of a 4-day work week are neither magic or automatic. They do require a redesign workflows and ways of working. And so if the only variable that you change is the number of hours that people work, and you have the same expectations and you're just trying to do the same work in the same way in less time, then absolutely there is a risk that that could lead to overwhelm work intensity. But at its core, this works as a work redesign initiative. And I think the reason why organizations have found success is because they've approached it in that way. I think to the question of pay, I think many organizations in the past, if we think back to the financial crisis, there were organizations that shifted to things like 4-day work week to try to preserve jobs at lower incomes, and maybe went back to full salary when the economic situation improved. But I think that's a different trade-off. I think you can't have it both ways. I think this is either a time for productivity exchange or it's a time for salary exchange. I do think in the long run, there are some risks. I mean, if you take Bill Gates, for example, he has predicted that AI could lead us to a 3-day work week, even a 2-day work week. I think if you're a government or a policymaker, you really need to be asking the questions of what sits underneath that. Is that a 3-day work week for everyone at the same salary? Or is that a situation where higher skilled workers, their market rate effectively goes up, and so they're able to command, the same money for less time? But for lower skilled workers, they end up in a situation where effectively they need to either work multiple jobs or be subsidized or underwritten by the state through some form of universal basic income. And I do think that, when we're thinking about how this might scale across the economy, those are the types of questions that we really need to be asking.
Joe, on your point on burnout, I couldn't agree more. I think, putting in a 4-day week, it's not just a flick of a switch and it's done for the company. You really have to have some very proactive planning and really look long and hard at your ways of working in order to do it effectively. So I think, the risk there from burnout is a huge risk, and it's there for every company. But that's not to say there aren't ways to mitigate that, but that's not going to happen naturally unless you take a really active steps to make sure it happens.
Are there any other risks out there that you've seen, Will or Joe, that we've not covered today?
Yeah, so from my side, I think there's one that I hear a lot, which is the risk of someone taking on a second job. But for us, it's we found quite an easy solution for that, really, which is to employ your employees on 40-hour contracts. So our contracts are structured that they're 40 hours a week, but we give employees 8 hours to use at their own discretion. So in that way, we are legally preventing them from taking on another job in that time off. But at the same time, we're also ensuring that time's then used for the purposes of having the 4-day week, so rest and recovery.
And Will, that's really interesting. Does that also mean that if you wanted to stop the 4-day working week and bring everyone back to 5, because you've given them a 40-hour work week, you could do that?
I think in theory, yes, but in practice, no.
But I do think that speaks to, another important risk of this, which is the reality today is for companies like Will's, this is not common practice in most industries. Most of your clients, most of your competitors, most of your key stakeholders are working standard work weeks. We may well, and I believe that we will, get to a future where this is commonplace across many industries, but that day is not today. And so as a result, for the organizations that are doing this, it does require a big commitment on the part of the workforce. It does require this partnership approach in order to make it work. And I think the benefit, the additional benefit of having that type of, even if there's no intention on the part of the company to go back, I think the fact that it is viewed as something that people need to continuously earn and viewed as something that requires this commitment to ongoing continuous improvement, rather than something that we've done a pilot, the pilot worked, now we've achieved the 4-day work week and we can kind of all go back to resting on our laurels. I think that kind of healthy, positive tension is a big part of the reason why this is so effective for so many organizations.
Again, I just want to drill a bit more there, Will, because it's not about an extra day off without boosting productivity. The kind of acid test is that companies, in theory, should be able to boost productivity by 25% on the days that they do work. So do you see that, in fact, your staff are working 40 days in 4 days, or they're working less in 4 days, but being much more productive?
Yeah, I think for us, it's definitely the latter. Like for us, it's really a mindset shift, and so it's the way that employees look at it, and they really see this as a big benefit that we're giving them compared to the status quo, and that benefit, as to Joe's point, is we don't have to have it there forever, and there is this idea that this is a benefit that has to be respected and earned by those employees. So they really do need to make sure that they are being more efficient and effective. And so we do see it that it's a mindset across the company, and that's the way people can work more efficiently and effectively to really be able to get more done in less time.
If we move now to a bit more on the tech and the AI, general discussion. So you've talked about how an AI augmented workforce might make a shorter week not just viable but necessary. But how does the 4-day work week intersect with other changes in the world of work, like hybrid working? Joe, do you want to take that?
Yeah, so maybe just to start with the AI question, because I think it's a really important one. The first point that I'd make is I think that most people can intuitively see the connection between AI and work time on the basis of the capacity that AI can create to do more in less time. But I think there's a few important points that sit underneath. The first is an equity and fairness question, which is that if you look at the global economy, if you look at global politics, social cohesion over the last decade or so, what we've seen in the United States, the growth of far-right movements in Europe, Brexit, a lot of the underpinning challenges around this were people who felt left behind by globalization, the last technological and digital revolution. And I think when we think about AI, we really do need to take a step back and think about how is this benefit being shared with the workforce in a very tangible way? And so I genuinely believe that a future of accelerated AI adoption across the economy that does not lead to a tangible benefit in the form of the amount of time that people are spending at work, is something that we actually need to think about through that lens as well. The second point I would make, if you're an employer or a leader today who's looking to kind of increase AI adoption within your business, there's this big problem that we have at the moment. A study in the US recently showed that actually 40% of the workforce is actively sabotaging its organization's AI strategy. And they're doing that effectively by refusing to engage with AI tools and AI outputs of the business. And a big reason for that is that there is so much doom and gloom, fear, skepticism among the workforce about what is this going to mean for me? Is this a new tool I need to learn at best, or is it a threat to my job at worst? And so I do think, there is an opportunity to kind of change the conversation on AI and really position this as something that can be a win-win for both employer and employee. That, you could have this type of model around time dividends, where if we can create 8 hours worth of extra capacity using AI, we will reinvest half of that in new projects and initiatives, and the other half we will give back to the workforce. And the last point I want to make is around shadow AI, because I think one of the big problems that organizations are facing today is that people are overwhelmed with workload. We have, as we know, across the economy, huge issues with burnout. Many studies suggesting somewhere between a third and 2/5 of the workforce is experiencing burnout. And a lot of AI initiatives, employees are not there's not discrete capacity being created for employees to learn, test, experiment, really build their capability with these new tools. We worked with a client here in Canada recently where instead of moving to a 4-day work week, they actually use that extra capacity to create AI internships on a Friday, where they're actually specifically carving out this time where employees aren't being expected to do this off the side of the desk. And I think that's a big reason why we're seeing many employees saying, if you're not going to give me time to learn these tools at work, I'm going to learn them on my own time outside of work. And I'm not going to share the learnings. I'm not going to share the outputs and the benefits with the employer.
Yeah, look, I'd fully agree. And I think that the one thing I'd add is also similar to those lines. It's really empowering your employees to be part of this shift and part of this movement. That's one thing that we take a very strong stance of here, is to empower employees at all levels to do that. And so it's actually in their interest to become, the super user of the next AI solution that we're going to adopt, because then they're first and foremost like integrating that into the business. And, that can be someone at the most junior level or the most senior. So
I would imagine that for some departments, it's a bit easier to measure, right? So, the sales team, you can still kind of track the number of calls, the number of sales, and, but for maybe other departments, it's harder. I've heard during this conversation that you've seen a reduction in absenteeism, or, there's less time that people need off for the medical appointments because they can do that in that day that they have off. But, what kind of KPIs do you kind of use to measure the success of it? You're looking at customer satisfaction. What's the output that you use to track that it's continually working?
yeah, exactly. Look, I'd be lying if I said it wasn't a challenge. And as you said, in some departments, it's much easier than others, and you see like a tangible impact it's having. But I think what you can really measure is this kind of cultural aspect, and how it feels, and in terms of like how staff are responding in terms of satisfaction and things like that with their job. And that is, you can tangibly measure that. And so the results that we're getting from that are very positive, and it really accelerates that actually, this is that the path we've chosen is the right one.
And I think that really speaks to the fact that many modern organizations really struggle to measure productivity. And so, if you're asking the question, I can't move to a 4-day work week because I don't know how to measure, then, your biggest problem isn't necessarily whether you're going to work 4 days or 5. Your biggest problem is you're not able to measure the value that your employees are creating. And, if you take research from Atlassian that showed 2/3 of knowledge workers think that it's more important to respond quickly to messages than it is to make progress on their top priorities. So I think one of the benefits of a 4-day work week is that, it's not one size fits all, but it does force organizations to think much more deeply about what are the measurements that really matter? What are the priorities that really drive value in the business, rather than relying on activity, presence, hours as kind of very ineffective proxies for these things. And so typically when we work with an organization, there are certain metrics that you can measure in quite a standard way, regardless of industry, regardless of, the type of work that people are doing. But you do need to actually, we just need to accept that productivity now is such a complex thing that we no longer have a single way of measuring it. And so organizations do need to go through that effort of defining at an organizational level what that looks like, defining at a team and even down to an individual level what those kind of key measures of success are. I think often the 4-day work week, it does one of two things. It either creates much more alignment across the workforce on what those key measures are, if you have them already, or it forces organizations to create them and really get buy-in from the workforce to, to say, look, you're offering us a benefit that is significant enough that we are prepared to, really lean into the conditionality that goes with that this is not a giveaway. This is something that does require us to hit these very clearly defined targets.
Really interesting. Yeah, very, very good point. As we wrap up this discussion, let me ask you both, if you could give one piece of advice to business leaders coming out of this discussion, what would it be? Will, do you want to start first?
Yeah, I think mine would be to any earlier stage business leaders listening to really consider the impact this might have, not just on productivity, but also the caliber of profiles that you can attract from the labor market at an early stage, as your first hires are usually the most critical.
Thank you. Joe?
I think number one, approach this with an open mind. I think that there's a lot of myths and misconceptions around this topic that hopefully we've gone some way to addressing during this conversation. I have yet to see, we've seen organizations who have explored this and ended up not going with a 4-day work week, but they have learned something about their organization in the process. I've seen organizations who have tried this and who have ended up doing something different at the end of it. But I've rarely seen an organization that said the process of exploring and experimenting with this was a wasted endeavor. You will learn so much about your business. You will uncover opportunities, flaws in your systems and processes. And you will show trust in the workforce by being prepared to actually try something like this out. But really critical, as Will said earlier, it's not a flick of the switch. It requires really careful planning and execution if you want to get the most benefits from it.
Thank you. This is such an interesting conversation, and I think the takeaways that I have is, it's not just a day off. It really is a conversation about productivity. It's also about thinking about how to unlock AI for a win-win, and really kind of moving away from the fear that there is still, with a lot of employees within the company about AI, to seeing how actually this can kind of really help them. I also think, your point about this is about empowering. This is about getting collective buy-in from the organisation to be a part of this thinking about how you make that shift. I think, and that can include, again, how do we measure success? What does that mean? What do we cut? How do we define that this is working, and kind of really making it a motivational, strategy as well, and that retention of talent, that attraction of talent, reduction in absenteeism, improve well-being. There's a lot there that's of upside, but as you said, it's really got to kind of be. You can't just flick the switch. That's what I'm hearing from both of you. It's not like from one day to the next. It really needs a lot of thought, at the team level, at the individual level, and careful monitoring to make sure that it's working and that the company's still achieving what it needs to. Well, that brings us to the end of this episode of Let's Talk Global Business. We'll be back next time with a focus on a new topic. You can find a host of content on the future of work, as well as listen to the entire catalogue of this podcast series from the Conference Board by visiting our website, conference-board.org. Thank you, Joe and Will, for sharing your insights with us. Until next time on Let's Talk Global Business.